Hello, eighth graders. So today starts the first real day of lessons that you'll have. Obviously, yesterday I listed that video for you to look at and also that calendar. So if you have not looked at both of those things, please do so because that will tell you what you are supposed to do every day for work for your social studies class. Today we are starting with the 7-3 discussion. I asked you to quickly reread that section yesterday if you have not already. It is rather short. Okay, but what we were talking about is the reform movements, and this is coming after 7-2 focused on mostly slavery and the how it spread in the South. Okay, so what reform means is how to fix things. So reform is to fix. Okay, so reform movements are going to be people attempting to fix the things they view are wrong in society. Okay, and we're going to talk about a variety of those instances and how people went about trying to fix those things. Okay, so in 7-3, I'm using my textbook, the same thing you have. So if you want to follow along, I highly recommend doing so. It's on page 402 is where I am right now. And as I go through and kind of do the discussion like we do in class, it'll be a little different, but relatively simple. You can follow along. I will also post the slides along with this video. Okay, so you can use those if you want to as well. All right, let's get started, shall we? All right, so an era of reform. Political ideals lead to reform. So what that means is people are going through their lives, and especially after Jackson, we talk about that Jacksonian democracy, right? Where the regular people are getting to have more of a say in the government. Okay, so because these regular people are getting to vote more, all right, not necessarily just the super rich white males, okay, but and it's still limited to males at this time, so don't forget about that. But more, you don't necessarily have to own property anymore, right? And you don't have to have certain requirements. So more and more men at this time are being able to vote. Women still cannot, okay, which we know is unfair. And also people of color probably cannot vote at this time. Not fair. But more and more people are starting to be able to vote, so it's starting to represent, you can almost say, more of the average person at this time. Although that's not entirely true, like I just said. Okay, so because of that, people are starting to get their way a little more. Okay, so people are starting to question the way things are. For example, social conditions. People are starting to question, what about working conditions, right? The Industrial Revolution, people are moving to more cities. Working conditions are not good. We've talked about the factories, how we talked about how people are, even small children are working. People are getting hurt. They're not being paid well. You're living in slums, right? So people are starting to question that, along with other things such as education. We'll talk about more about women's rights, more about people of color's rights. Okay, all of those things are going to be focused on here. Religion is focused on a little bit, and we'll get into all those things. Okay, so what kind of spurs all of these movements, along with regular people, regular, kind of in quotations there, getting to vote more, is the Second Great Awakening. Okay, now the Second Great Awakening starts with religion. Okay, so what it is prior to the Second Great Awakening, people had believed in predestination, which means at the time that you are born, it is already determined whether you are or what you're doing in the afterlife. Okay, it's determined what's going to happen in your afterlife. Was believed. Okay, that's called predetermination, and it was believed before the 1700s. In the 1700s, people started to go, that's not really fair. Okay, so they started to believe that, or they started to teach a lot of Protestants, which remember means that you are Christian but not Catholic. Okay, started to believe that it's what you do in your life that determines what happens to you in the afterlife, which is what most people who practice religion nowadays also believe, right? It's what you do in your life that determines what happens to you in the afterlife. So in the 1700s, this belief starts to take over. They're like, predetermination is not fun, right? Like, what's the point of me being born and already knowing that I'm doomed, right? So they're like, oh, this shouldn't be this way. So they started to believe that it's what you do in your life that determines what happens to you. Okay. During this Second Great Awakening, church started to change a little bit again, like we talked about earlier. The leaders, okay, these priests, all those types of people are starting to change, and they're starting to buy into this more of what happens during your life. They start to preach, do good things, right? Help other people, do all the stuff to try and make sure that you have a good afterlife. Okay. They hold. You can see in the vocab words here are these revivals, which are huge outdoor meetings. Revivals might last for days and attract thousands of people. Okay, the reason why is because these preachers are starting to become more boisterous, and the songs in church are starting to become more popular. And it's not just some guy standing in front of you talking. Right now, it's starting to become more and more interesting. People are starting to believe also, right? Plus, the amount of people that come to church might increase if they believe that, hey, I'm not doomed from the start, right? Like it helps. It depends what I do. So that probably convinces more people to also come when the idea of predetermination kind of goes away. Okay, so the idea of the second great awakening starting in religion also spurs some other things that we're going to talk about as well. Okay, it branches out into other pieces of American culture. I'm on page 404 right now if you're following along. For example, there were some famous people that were very religious that started to use these concepts of the Second Great Awakening and practice them into other areas of the world. Okay, one of those people was Dorothea Dix. Okay, what she did is focused on reforming the care of the disabled. At this time, most of the people who had been disabled for one reason or another, whether you were having issues with your brain or whatever the case may be, you were probably put into prison, right? You were not treated as a patient, but you were treated as a prisoner. And what she did is she visited all these prisons and jailhouses in Massachusetts, is discovered that it was an incredible amount of people that were in these prisons and jails that were not there because they had done something wrong, but they were there because they were mentally ill. Okay, so she had decided to focus her life work on making sure those people could instead receive the treatment that they need. Okay, she wanted to make sure that those people went to hospitals instead of prisons. So she had focused most of her life on trying to be able to convince legislation, which is the people who make laws, to put those people who are mentally ill into hospitals rather than prisons, which seems rather fair, right? Okay, so she's taking that idea of that second great awakening, that religious movement, and putting it into caring for the disabled people. Okay, also along with the prison reform, it was discovered at this time while she was going through it that 5 out of every 6 people that were in prison were there because they owed money. If you owed money to someone at this time, you are called a debtor, right? So if you owe someone, you're in debt. Well, a debtor is just someone who owes money. So 5 out of 6 people in prison were there because they were debtors. Okay, now let's think about that. You're in prison because you owe money. Therefore, you have to pay that money off to get out of prison. If you're in prison, can you make a lot of money? No, right? So therefore, often these people who were there because they owed money had to stay there for many, many years because they had no way of paying it back. Okay, so eventually, again, this was realized that, hey, not fair, right? These people owe money. They haven't committed a serious crime. They just owe money. So they needed a chance to work off that money. And this was, again, an opportunity to reform prisons. So people over the years also worked on creating a system. Dorothea Dix started it, okay, where debtors were not treated as serious criminals as if they had committed a crime, but rather that they needed programs to be able to pay that money off. Okay, so this, again, it was not an overnight change by any means. She didn't just walk into prisons and go, hey, debtors shouldn't be here. And they're like, oh, yeah, you're right. No, this took many, many years of trying to get this fixed. She had to talk to legislators, which, again, are people who make laws, okay, to try and get these things changed. Also, along with prison reform, we've talked about obviously the care of the disabled, prison reform. Finally, the next movement we're going to talk about is the temperance movement. And what temperance means is trying to get people to stop drinking alcohol so much. Okay, during the 1800s, there was a lot of people that were drinking too much. Okay, and what this led to is kind of situations in where violence was happening at home, families were being broken up, lots of fights in public, lots of people being put into jail and prison because they were drinking too much and getting into trouble. Okay, so it was actually women who led a majority of the temperance movements, and they were attempting to make it so that either people did not drink so much or that people could not drink at all. Okay, the first state to actually pass these laws was Maine. Maine had banned the sale of alcohol during the early 1800s. Okay, a few other states, I believe it's 5 or 6, also went on to do the same thing and pass what were called the Maine laws. Now, these laws were mostly repealed rather quickly, which means they were taken away. They didn't exist anymore. But if you know anything about United States history, towards the end of the 1800s, early 1900s, we're going to come into a period of time again where we actually make an amendment to the Constitution that bans the sale of alcohol. So this issue does not go away. Okay, people are drinking too much, and they're not being productive, and they are causing harm to one another. So therefore, the temperance movement aims to fix that. Okay, so that's something to keep in mind. Finally, we're going to get to the big topic of today, which is the educational reform. Okay, at this time, public schools are not necessarily good. Okay, teachers are not paid well. Students don't always go. The schools are not in good shape. There's not materials to learn with. Okay, Massachusetts is actually the only state at this time with required schooling for male only. Okay, through 8th grade. But again, teachers are not paid well. There's no materials. The schoolhouses aren't good. Everybody, no matter how old you are, is in the same classroom. Okay, it's not a good situation. What ends up happening here is the education reform kind of works on solving these problems. Okay, you're going to hear about Horace Mann when you're reading. He becomes the leader of Massachusetts education, and he becomes the person who really tries to get those public funds. Okay, uses tax money to make schooling better, pay teachers more, get the materials you need, have teachers go to college, that kind of stuff, to make sure that he believed that people need to be educated to have a really good society. Okay, and I think that's true also, right? If you didn't have to go to school, if nobody had to learn things, would we as society be where we are at now? Probably not, right? So it's important, and he believed that and really got it started in Massachusetts, which then branched off into other states as well. So Horace Mann, important person, okay? Of course, at this time, only white male children are allowed to go to those public schools, but, okay, since people are focused on reforming things at this time period, there are starting to become some opportunities, obviously not the same, and no, it's not fair, okay, and we all know that, and people weren't treated right, but that's the way it was, and that's why we learn about history, okay, so people of color and also females at this time are starting to get some opportunities in maybe private schools. For example, in I believe it was Boston and New York, they actually set up separate schools for people of color to go to, males, okay, that they could get a public education. Now, I'm sure you can probably guess that they were not the same quality that white students got to go to, and no, it's not fair, okay? Obviously, that's why people are working to reform these types of things. Along with that, some African Americans were also able to go to private universities such as Harvard, Dartmouth, and Oberlin. Okay, these colleges were, because they were private institutions accepting people of color, so they were able to further their education, become very successful in this time period, and I'm sure if you look either in your book or do some research of your own, you can find those successful people. Okay, and finally, we're going to talk about reforming education for people with disabilities. Okay, during this time, if you were deaf or blind, it was probably nearly impossible for you to get an education. Why? Because you could not do things like, maybe if you were blind, obviously you can't read. If you're deaf, you can't hear, right? So during this time, they started to create schooling for those people, right? They created schools for both the blind and for the deaf, okay? Now, obviously, if you're blind, they have reading systems that you can use called Braille. It's those raised bumps that you kind of run your fingers over. You learn to do that the same way that you learn to read, okay? And then, obviously, if you are deaf, you have to focus more on reading things, but it is possible to learn that way. So they created schools for these people. so that way they were treated fairly or more fairly and could also get an education so that society can advance. And again, this is all happening because of the Second Great Awakening. Okay, people are doing this because they believe that it's the right thing to do. This form of religion where if I do good things in my life, it helps me in the afterlife, is really starting to make people do these good things and start to help other people, rather than that idea of predetermination where when I'm born, it's already decided what's happening to me when I die. Okay, so that's definitely something to keep in mind as we move through this. We talked about all those Reformation processes. If you have questions about anything that I've talked about today, any of those types of reformations, if what I said didn't really make sense to you, if you read something and you're like, I don't get this, Mr. Stensrud, or if you have questions at all about, hey, why did this happen? Why weren't these people treated fairly? Any of that type of stuff, shoot me an email. I can either respond to you in email form, or we can set up some kind of session where I can talk to you one-on-one and potentially answer your questions. Okay? Make sure for tomorrow you are obviously watching this. This is for the 15th, okay? So you're watching this video on the 15th. On the 16th, I will have my first guided reading form for you. What that guided reading form is going to do is make sure that you are getting my big points from not only my discussion with you, but also from the reading. So that's going to be on Google Classroom. I will have you submit that. You don't have to share it with me. It's just when you're done, you click on it, you hit classwork, hit submit to Mr. Stensrud. Boom, I get it. Okay, that is something you need to do. It is not optional. Okay, that is how I'm keeping track of people, making sure you're doing your assignments. Okay, if you need time, if you don't have access to a computer, okay, or a smartphone with data, let me know so we can get something worked out. Okay, again, you need to communicate with me. If you are not able to watch these videos, obviously you're probably not going to know this then, but I had some issues with YouTube yesterday with students not being able to access it. Talk to your classmates that have figured it out, or talk to me. I had to change some settings so that you are approved to watch these videos, but hopefully everything is solved now. Okay. All right. I think that is all I have for today. Make sure for tomorrow you are prepared to do those guided reading questions. Okay. So make sure you read. You can watch this video more than one time. That's why I'm putting them on YouTube. Okay. Even if you want to listen to me talk while you fill out your guided reading questions tomorrow, perfect. Okay. As long as you are getting the big points about what I want you to learn, I am happy. Okay. All right. Make sure you stay healthy. Have a good rest of your day. Please send me any questions that you might have. Bye now.